Okay, okay, you guys here? Okay. I just want to slip in real quickly before we actually start this video to let you know that this topic has always been a quick ignition trigger topic in the fandom. There's a lot of people think that George is following real world science or real world Egypt or something when it comes to incest. I gotta say that this is another case where he's really making up um, his own rules to his own world. So yeah, I love you. I love you guys out there. I have a lot of shipper friends that are out there, but yeah, this subject with all of the George material that's included. Oh goodness, just know that I love you. Hang on, I'm here for you. Okay, so you're still here. Great. That means you have some interest in the topic of incest and how George R.R. Martin is using it in all of Martinworld, not just A Song of Ice and Fire. In case you don't know yet, I am Leech. I am the one that has developed this Martinworld style of literary analysis where I compared George to himself one line at a time, one of his 80 plus stories at a time. And today we are going to talk about that not troublesome topic at all, incest. So there's an all too common idea among readers of A Song of Ice and Fire in the fandom who have this notion that an author like George R.R. Martin is pro-incest, maybe, or perhaps promoting it, or it's no big deal, or he's just including it because some point in real world history some incest was going on, some interbreeding and inbreeding was going on, or that is just, for whatever reason, just normal in A Song of Ice and Fire. That is not quite right. And we're going to look at all of George's stories, and we're going to discuss, there's a couple of different sections here, about 17 sections. I'm going to give you the link to all of this information because while I'm going to touch on a lot of these subjects, we're not going to go that in depth in this particular video because I want it to remain like a reasonable, viewable length for those out there that are interested. I'm going to try to keep it under an hour. But the topics we're going to discuss are real world rules need not apply, A Song of Ice and Fire, incest definitions, author influence, which is gatherings, what he prefers, the Stark tree actually branches. We're going to talk about that whole Stark angle that a lot of people sort of misrepresent in their own discussions in the fandom. There is the CR/KR naming system in Martinworld. There is, which brings us back to we're going to touch on some other Stark issues again. There's going to be the odd snowball, Cregan Stark, and the exceptionality of it all. And then along the way, we're going to have a lot of George quotes in there, but it's going to bring us basically to section 9. It's all going to start coming together from George's angle. When we talk about how he very explicitly in an interview says, I am not condoning incest. And then it's abominable, what it means in his entire world, not just the Song of Ice and Fire, Karstarks and Wentz, because there are no exceptions to this rule. We might have like primary example, secondary example, and tertiary example. Reverse that, tertiary and secondary, because those are the supporting literary systems that are propping up the A-level plot arc where this may or may not happen and why. So it's part of George's 3-part reveal, as his one of his editors likes to has talked about before. A little hint, a medium hint, and then bam, hits you over the head with it. And then them squids, we're going to talk a little bit about them squids, the Greyjoys. Arianne and her dreams, Manderly manners, Frey family values. Yes, I have a fandom friend that came up with that one, and I loved it, and she gave me permission to use it. Frey family values. Aunt Lysa's grasping. Remember, Aunt Lysa, she is a fiery Spider Woman analog in A Song of Ice and Fire, something George has been developing throughout all of Martinworld. And the Lannister twins. So, yeah, if you have any questions or any additional bits of information, always up for discussing this. So with that said, let's get going. Okay, and per usual, because usually by the time I'm starting this recording, I've already been staring at the screen for about an hour or two, and my eyes are getting puffy and worn out, so okay. All right, now I can see. All right, real world need not apply. Brother and sister avunculate marriages are found among the pharaohs of ancient Egypt and the god kings of South America's Inca Peru Empire. Tutankhamun's parents, for example, are thought by some to have been full siblings. Among these cultures, rulers drew on the aspects of religion to legitimize their power and wielded it through the construction of extravagant monuments. See George's story in Seven Times Never Kill Man, or A Song for Lya, as 2 examples. In A Song of Ice and Fire, that means the Ice Dragon Others and the Fire Dragon Targaryens are these 2 corporate/governmental extremes that both practice incest for godlike reasons, which gives them control and power. In short, there are secondary examples of incest in the series, and those are there to support the main plot points, and we will discuss those. So in all 80 plus of George's stories that I have that are available, that I have read or watched, more than 80 stories he has out there. 7 of them have incest, either actual incest or what I call implied incest. And an example of implied incest is the story Night Flyers, where Royd Eris is the clone of the Dragon Mothership. And so at one point he refers to the Dragon Mothership as the mother, and she created him to basically to serve her and to be her mate, almost a plaything. But then she unexpectedly died. That incest never happened. And Roy rejected it, the whole idea of it anyway. And then when Melantha Gerald walks on stage, Royd Eris, he's like, hey, I like you much better. So that's an example of some of the implied incest that George has going on in his stories. So if you hear people across whatever interweb page you're on, they're saying, why is George so obsessed with incest? He's not obsessed with it. I mean, it's a very small fraction of his stories, and every single time he puts it in there, the whole point, and purpose of it is it brings about a downfall of a dynasty, whether it's a huge galaxy dynasty, whether it's just Royd Eris, whether it's one clan from Bitter Blooms. Every single solitary time he puts it in, it brings down a dynasty, let's just say. So inbred royalty from the real world has little to do with the incest angle in A Song of Ice and Fire, aside from world building. However, even real world dynasties died off because of the negative consequences of inbreeding. The dynastic god-king politics is what Martin is weeding through. And I hope by the end of this video that you'll be able to see that, and it will help make some speculating in A Song of Ice and Fire a little more clear, a little easier, however you want to word it. Helps pave that road. Because honestly, the other thing that George writes about much more favorably and much more commonly in his stories, all of his stories, is something that is orgies. Let me just say it. He calls them, off and on, calls them gatherings. Or polygamy. He writes about polygamy and polyamorous open relationships. And even genetic splicing and hybrids of half-breeds and mongrels and bastards, as they're referred to in the stories. This includes marriages with a variety of men and women, and who goes with whom. This, whether it's men with men, women with women, mixed species, sexing, all of it. He writes about that so much more favorably than anything else. And marriage isn't always necessary either. Remember, he's hippie free love generation. So anybody that reads my posts, my essays, watches these videos, you'll hear me say over and over again that in overall Martinworld themes, which includes includes A Song of Ice and Fire, this is more of the fire consumes to feed the one individual, whereas the green nature consumes and it shares with the many. Incest serves the one, polyamory serves the many. And I'm going to keep saying this a few times. So these smaller examples of incest compared to like an open love or polyamory in George's stories, we see this with the small examples because that helps support the large examples. Alysanne Blackwood, the second wife of Lord Craigenstart, is rumored to have been fond of Lady Sabitha Frey. Compare that Frey to Black Walder Frey. He is the fire element. Okay, so Alysanne Blackwood with Sabitha Frey, they're all up in the green element Stark area of the woods. And then we have Black Walder Frey, who is essentially part of the Riverlands others, and that particular fire element. Black Walder Frey is rumored to have multiple incest. Whether or not he did is not the point. The point is that rumor is out there because that sets the tone for the story. So I'm going to read a George quote for you guys. I love this one. Let's see. The question: one of the aspects of the novella they've incorporated is the future's more liberated attitude about sex as a recreational activity, or sexing, as the characters call it. George: well, you know, I wrote that after the sexual revolution and the hippies. I think it's a healthy attitude, and hopefully it will arrive someday in the future here. That was certainly my intent, to portray sex, how sex can be more casual. It can be, oh, I had sex with Bill, like, oh, I had dinner with Bill. Why did the two have to be so different? If you're married to Fred and you have dinner with Bill, Fred doesn't care. But if you say you had sex with Bill, suddenly it's divorce and trauma. Why? I don't know. It's part of our religious upbringing, a legacy of past centuries. But 400 years in the future, when Night Flyers was first set, it would certainly be a very different attitude. I love that quote, and I also love, one of the reasons why I love it so much is because how he has, what he's doing with the Song of Ice and Fire. The whole point of Bran and bringing back the green tree element is that brings on enlightenment. I'll link to it. Green seeing means enlightenment, and this is going to be part of it. So we can sit here and bicker about dynasties and what the rule is in Westeros for inheritance and all that stuff, but that is all going to fundamentally change. Maybe not by the end of the book, but we're going to see the grounds for that change be set up, whether it's in the last 2-3 chapters or an epilogue. But this story is not being told just to reset everything back to normal. No, Song of Ice and Fire is going to show some progress. And there's a great interview from George at the end of 2019 where somebody asks him, what does George want in a story? And they're talking about the science fiction and fantasy stories in particular. And George says what he's trying to, believe it or not, what he's trying to write back into A Song of Ice and Fire is the need for hope. A lot of stories are lacking hope in the last several trends or decades, or however you want to phrase it. There's been a lot of dystopian stories. George wants to bring back hope, and that's what the green element is. So to be clear, George has his own rules for his own story, borrowing from myth and history, and he rewrites it as his own. That's what he says, that he borrows all sorts of stuff and he rewrites it as his own. Scientific, real world reality, be damned. Seriously, like, what's the real world science for mixing dragon blood with human blood and then hatching dragons? I mean, that's where we are. So we're discussing his own author intent, his own voice within his own literature, not real world life. So what is incest in A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, maesters are generally the ones that we readers go to when we're trying to find any sort of guideline or parameter for a, quote, rule. And I am using that term rule a little bit loosely, but you know what I mean. So the books tell us very specifically, the tradition amongst Targaryens has always been to marry kin to kin. Wedding brother to sister was thought of to be ideal. Failing that, a girl might wed an uncle, a cousin, or a nephew, a boy or a cousin or a niece, an aunt or a niece. This practice went back to old Valyria. Remember, they were slavers. Went back to old Valyria, where it was common amongst many of the ancient families, particularly those who bred and rode dragons. The blood of the dragon must remain pure, the wisdom went. So people in old Valyria, not just dragon riders, this says right there, it was common amongst many of the ancient families, particularly those who bred dragons, rode and bred dragons. So we're told in the main canon series, and even with the extra books like the World History book and Fire and Blood, that this is something that's primarily reserved for the Targaryens to do, and Targaryens are the fire element. So to commit incest is to commit an act of fire, and that is out of balance with this world, this planetos, and that is something that George is showing us examples of in the story so he can show why it's wrong. That's the whole author show don't tell. You can't just say wearing glasses is wrong and in the books, and nobody ever wears glasses because it's wrong. No, you have to show why, you have to show it happening, and you have to show why it's wrong. And that's how an author shows doesn't tell. So there's nothing wrong with wearing glasses, by the way. So knowing all of this, plus more, if Jon and Daenerys end up romantically linked, it will end in disaster. If Jon and Dany end up getting together, it's going to because this goes much further into like George's outline and what he said he has had planned for Dany with this mental mind control thing. That's called proximity telepathy. You read about it in a lot of George's stories, especially in A Song for Lya and in Seven Times Never Kill Man and in Tough Voyaging. I mean, there's a slew of them. But what happens is the fire element, the pyramid element, especially from In Seven Times Never Kill Man, when you go close to it, that's when you're under its influence. When you get further away from it, that mental hold, almost religious-like influence, breaks, and you can actually start to think for yourself again. This is what's happening with Stannis and Melisandre, and this is what's happening with Jaime and Cersei. But those are different videos. Okay, so not just Jon and Dany getting together. If Jon and Arya ended up together, that George has it planned, you know, in his style, that it would end badly. So I know that in George's outline, he says, he writes about how Jon and Arya figure out that they have an attraction to each other. We do not know if they ever acted on that. We do not know whatever happened to that. That is a complete open-ended idea he had. And he has said, and I have my Balticon report where he said it to me and a Jon Arya shipper. He's like, no, I don't have that plan for them anymore. If I could go back and change some clues I may have had in the beginning, I would have, because he has shifted that from that incest away from the Starks. That's why we have Gendry. If Jon and Sansa get together, that's gonna be bad. That's not a good thing. If Sansa and Sweet Robin get together, that's gonna be bad. Not gonna be a good thing. Danny and Aegon the Sixth, bad. I would even include Aegon and Arianne in that as well. It's gonna be bad. And so on, but especially the main characters. Basically, rooting for blood purity and eugenics is extremely out of brand for an author like George to support. We should be cheering for this, you know, I think he wants us to ask, and a lot of people don't get this, is should we be cheering for this type of culture? One that has a mission to control dragons. Dragons that George has said are nuclear weapons. They have the power to destroy, not to build, not to rule. Again, green element, fire element. And I'll add to that if Dany wants to come to Westeros and continue to be some sort of breaker of chains, which is a little bit problematic already in Martinworld terms, she needs to completely change the system, and that includes the gifting of young girls and women as brood mares in exchange for alliances. She can't do that. She can't marry her own family and keep this blood purity dynasty that thinks that they have the right, some sort of gifted right to rule over everybody else. Remember, George says that, and he even wrote it into his story Fever Dream, if you want to see how it plays out. The Iron Throne is like Ozymandias, and the ship in the story Fever Dream was originally called Fever Dream, and then it was changed to Ozymandias. It's look on ye mighty and fear my works and all that other stuff. I have it all linked if you want to read it. It's not something to worship. It's something that needs to be dismantled because it's a sign of oppression. So this is another favorite quote of mine because it applies to so many things in Martinworld and A Song of Ice and Fire. And it's from an interview a little while back where he says, I've been planning all these clues that the butler did it. Then you're halfway through a series and suddenly thousands of people have figured out the butler did it. And then you say the chambermaid did it. No, you can't do that. So I'm including this because in all of Martinworld, including very clearly in A Song of Ice and Fire, he's setting incest up to be, very simply put, the downfall of a dynasty, whether it's from the high level or it's the secondary level, all of that stuff. He's not giving us all of those clues and hints and laying it out there for us just to get to his 11th chapter and be like, psych, I forgot. Forgot to change this along the way. It was really the chambermaid that did it. It wasn't the butler. No, that's not what he's doing. So remember that Targaryens go kin to kin. So kin is a little more broad of a term than some may realize. It's a noun. It's a person's relatives collectively, the kinfolk, family or relationship. It's the same thing that Ygritte or Jon goes through with Ygritte in A Storm of Swords, Jon 3. It says, Longspear's not your brother. He's of my village. You know nothing, Jon Snow. A true man steals a woman from afar to strengthen the clan. Women who bed brothers or fathers or clan kin offend the gods and are cursed with weak and sickly children, even monsters. So, I mean, that's why Val calls Monster later, but side note, Val doesn't hate Monster. She actually quite likes Monster and starts to sing to him in her own little moon singer wolf lady way. Different video though. Focusing to focus. So yeah, I mean, again, any chance that George gets with this, he hits it over our head that you don't go clan kin to clan kin, and that includes cousins and uncles and other children, any sort of blood relation, and then any nieces and so what about those Starks? We're going to get to them in just a second because I want to get to talk just a little bit. Again, if you want to read all of it, I'll link to it here. It's on my page on my blog. The page title is Downfall of a Dynasty. So author influence. Gatherings. George R.R. Martin, from a Playboy interview a couple years back. He says, avoid incest at all cost. I may write about incest, but I do not endorse it. Let us make that perfectly clear. So what he does instead is he has something called gatherings, which are basically big orgies where the point is to spread your DNA to non-related people. If you go through his autobiographical notes in various books and Watchmen interviews, he often talks about his time at a writers' convention in the 70s and 80s where there was a lot of fluid sex going on. So this is something George is pulling from his time in the writing world, his time in the con world, his time in just, growing up in the 60s and 70s. This theme of rejected incest and incest only practiced by those in Martin's stories are either mad or morally dark gray or just plain villains. It's a form of mind control or mental and physical slavery. So a few instances of some gatherings. Hold on. We see them with Varamir, of all people, in the prologue. And it actually makes a lot of sense because Varamir goes to something that's a gathering. That is where, when all of the the wargs and skin changers and everything, they get together in a gathering, they're spreading their seed. That's what that is. George uses this very explicitly in his his story Bitter Blooms. Sean is the little girl. She attends gatherings where she has non-marital sex, resulting in children with other non-related people in effort to spread the gene pool. She has 9 kids in total, and she's honored for it, because before, what was happening in her clan is there was a genetic depression because of this. The way it's written in the book, or in this story, and it's not a very long story, so we don't have a ton of back history on it, but the clan leader's name was Craig, and let me see if I can find it here. And he's very Craster-like, and he sort of forces people in the clan to mate with each other. Like, he doesn't like it when they go out to these gatherings. So Craster is a Craig. That's that CRKR name meaning that I've talked about in this story, in Sand Kings, and all sorts of places. And actually, very symbolically, the story Bitter Blooms opens with the death of Incest. And read the story. I'll have it linked. I have it transcribed. It's sad, but it's necessary. So another story of George's where there's a bunch of incest that amongst a certain collected elite of families is in his werewolf story, The Skin Trade. And Jonathan Harmon, who is the main, the father, patriarchal leader of basically the antagonists, the villains of the story. Towards the end, he gives Randy, who's another Val archetype, this little lesson. He says, "I'll kill you." "I think not." He leaned over the bed. "Perhaps I'll come for you myself some night. You ought to see me, Miss Wade. My fur is white now," because he's really old. "But the stature, the majesty, the power, those have not left me. Michael was a half-breed, and your Willie, he was hardly more than a dog. The pure blood is rather more. We are the dire wolves, the nightmares who haunt your racial memories, the dark shapes circling endlessly beyond the lights of your fires." So he's Jonathan Harmon's giving her this lecture, and the reason why, and we read about this a lot in the story, is because there's a genetic depression going on with these so-called purebloods. They're dying out because their purity, their blood purity, has killed them all. They can't work the change. Willie can. Willie's the Jon Snow prototype in this story. And this whole story is basically like a Stark and Bolton history, Red King Bolton history, before George wrote it into A Song of Ice and Fire, where it's kind of like wolf against wolf. Willie's the only one that can change it now, is because he's not a result of incest. He's also the only one that can do something sort of magically. I don't want to do too many spoilers, but he's the only one that was able to achieve something that the others couldn't. And then Jonathan Harmon's son, he has some problems from the inbreeding. And his father, Jonathan Harmon, even starts to recognize it, but he is so obsessed with being this pure blood that he's disappointed in his son, but he doesn't care. It's all about like the Targaryens. The Targaryens answered to neither gods nor men. That's what it says in the Clash of Kings. It says the Dragon Kings had wed brother to sister, but they were the blood of old Valyria, where such practices had been common. And like their dragons, the Targaryens answered to neither gods nor men. I'll give you one more example, even though there was plenty of stories, where this inbreeding causes a genetic depression. Is in and then we'll move on to something else. In Dark Dark were the tunnels. The idea of incest is rejected right from the start, and it's never practiced. And the society chose to die off rather than have sexual relations with related family. In the current timeline, the humans who fled and colonized the moon have returned to Earth because fresh genetic stock is running low on the moon. So they are looking for other humans that perhaps fled underground. So from Dark Dark were the tunnels. It says the idea of inbreeding didn't go over. Now the population's going up again, but slowly. We're stagnant. It took us nearly 5 centuries to get space travel going again. And then they go on a little bit more, and they say we need fresh viewpoints, fresh genetic stock. We need the stimulation of contact with a foreign culture. So over and over again, when he does write it into his stories, over and over again, it's either rejected right off the bat, or it brings about a downfall, whether it's a small clan or whether it's a whole family like the Targaryens. So the Stark family tree actually branches. That's part of the pun of it all. This is where the section where I talk about this. So, because you hear a lot, but the Starks practiced incest, which is not true on its face within the Stark line or any other northern line, except with the Cregan Karstark example below. And then if you follow the notes. It's not even in any other line except for the Targaryens. Not the Dothraki, the Andals, the Ibbenese, the Yeti, nobody. Now, if I'm forgetting something, again, let me know. But I've been on this subject for a long time, many, many, many years, and I've never had anybody give me any other examples. So no, Eddard's parents were not practicing incest the way that we are thinking of. They were second cousins once removed, which is probably enough genetic diversity to remove that incest taint. There's plenty of discussion out there and plenty of quotes from George where he says that the population of the North just isn't as dense as it is in the other kingdoms. So for various reasons. So second cousins once removed. That's not cousin to cousin. That's not uncle to niece. That's not brother to sister. And then this goes back to what George just said about the Karstarks claiming to be kin. But they were claiming to be kin because they didn't want to die at that point. So there's a lot of claims to things in the story that aren't actually there. It's just the character trying to force a point, and that point doesn't save them. So one more thing, I have a little diagram here, not a diagram, but like a little note section that says Rickard is actually, he's Royce, Blackwood, Locke, and Stark. Lyara is Royce, Flint, Stark, and she could actually be more Royce and Karstark, Flint, and Stark, if you want to, put her in the same general level as, like, genetic level as Rickard. So there's a lot of new blood that is being introduced into them. But the thing is they are not first cousins, and they are not brother, sister, niece, uncle, nothing like that. So that is something that we'll talk about again a little bit when we just briefly touch on Wyman Manderly and this Stark potential incest that never actually went anywhere with the other ones. In a minute, we'll get to it. All right, that brings us to the naming theme that George has, the CR, CRA, Craig, something naming theme. And I'm not, this is something that I've discussed about in the fandom. I mean, I've been in this fandom I've been reading these books for a decade and a half, and I haven't been in like an active fandom that entire time, but I have been for quite a while now. And man, when I bring this subject up, people like fight it tooth and nail, and I don't understand why. We have George pretty much telling us, he says, ultimately it comes down to what sounds right, and I struggle with that, finding the right name for a character. If I can't find the right name, I don't know who the character is, and I can't proceed. So there's plenty of George quotes, if you really want them out there, where he talks about how he chooses his names carefully. Yes, we know he goes from a baby book, but for many of them, but what does the baby book do? It doesn't just give you a name, it gives you the history and the definition and the meaning of a name. And that's what he says he's looking for. So the CR naming theme, Craig from Bitterblooms, Craster, let me scroll down here, Craig and Stark, Craig and Karstark, and these are all of the one-off, some of them are one-off examples, but these are all of the examples of basically in the North, especially, again, going back to Bitterblooms and that whole northern environment. This is something that George is repurposing for Song of Ice and Fire. That was a Craig. So this whole northern icy snowy area that has these little bits of questionable incest, all of them are not good. No bueno, not good. Craster, you know, we all know what he is doing when he's up to. It's disgusting. He's lying to his wives as well. And then there's even the part with Craster where he's talking about, if a man wants to bed a woman, it seems like you ought to take her to wife, and that's what I do. So when he marries his daughters and forces, you know, basically rapes them and forces them to have children, that's when the Raven mutters, slave, slave. So that's something to consider. Again, remember, going back to Valyria. What Craster is doing is he's forcing Incest to provide the Ice Dragon others an army. What does George say in and out of the story? Dragons are bred for war. So, and I mentioned Craig Stark from history. He also went against the norm in the North by, number one, being Hand of the King during the Hour of the Wolf. Craig tried to do work in the South. We know this from the main series that northern men melt in the South. They can't, that's against their nature to go down there and mess with the den of adders or a nest of adders. He's dancing, Craig Stark, he's dancing too close to the incest fire to allowance with the Pact of Ice and Fire. So again, he's doing things out of the norm, out of the green, natural, nature, tree, whatever you want to call it, norm. It should have been Craig who was a leader, but instead he bent the knee. And what do the free folk say that the Dornish also say is, you know, you will not bend us or break us. Craig broke. He was burned by the tree. So Craig Karstark is also going against the northern norm and trying to force an incest marriage on his clan kin Alice as a means for a power grab. Noticing how all of this is related to power. What they're doing is, with the Alice situation, is they're trying to get the rightful heir out of the Karstarks line, and they're betraying the North. This is how Alice sees the marriage, and the proposal to her cousin uncle, and she is very upset about. She says, my brother Harrion is the rightful lord, and by law I am his heir. So they're trying to get Harrion out of there. They're trying to usurp The Karstarks are the bad brother to the Starks at this point. And she goes on, she says, Cregan is his son. I suppose that makes him a cousin, but we always call him uncle. Now they mean to make me call him husband. She made a fist. She got angry. And then she goes on to say that her father was, meant to find another lord for her to marry, but he never did. He never got there. So again, I will say this a lot, that the free folk in the story are George's, the way he's writing the fantasy version of his hippie free folk experience, his hippie free folk friends, companions, authors, all of that. So Jon Snow, Storm of Swords, he says, he's of my village, you know nothing, Jon Snow. A true man steals a woman from afar to strengthen the clan. Women who bed brothers or fathers or clan kin offend the gods and are cursed with weak and sickly children, even monsters. So that's a very important point to keep in mind. Which brings us to the next section. It says, we're talking about a few things about the Stark incest issues later, or I'm sorry, actually not later, but earlier in their history that we don't learn about till later. So it's this other thing when people go and look in the history book, the Big World of Ice and Fire book, and they're like, aha, look, but the Starks practiced incest. No, they didn't. Again, it's a power grab move. Jonelle and Edric Stark were only half cousins to Serena and Sansa Manderly Stark. I'm not sure if or where it counts on the abomination scale, but Jonelle and Edric came from Cregan, so we're back to the CR name again. If Eddard's parents being cousins once removed is enough of a genetic spread, then maybe this is two, possibly. But what we see going on here is a power grab attempt by the Manderleys of that era as they're trying to get their Manderley blood into the ruling house that is Winterfell and the Starks. As much as I love Wyman Manderley, I have a feeling it's more like one of these things on the list of keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on Lord Manderley, looking for Rickon and why and what he proposes with them. Wyman Manderley has some green-haired daughters and granddaughters and all of and whatnot that are going to be looking for husbands soon, especially after the Freys are kind of like dropping like hot meat. So back to this Jonelle thing. The most important part, and I have a lot more of this written, I'm just going to read this one important part. The most important, none of the half uncle niece marriages went back into the main branch of the Stark house. So they either never had children, one of them died, something like that. That any potential bloodline that came from an incest union between these Starks never happened, and there was nothing to go back into that bloodline. This is a one-off situation where we should be looking at why it's happening and not just, casually flitting it off like, oh, the Starks are incest practitioners when they're not. Pay attention to the type of story that we're reading overall. Because this goes with exactly what George was talking about for why Tywin married his own first cousin, which he says explicitly was to gain and maintain power. Tywin was a hot-blooded Targaryen in more ways than one, especially at the start of his time in King's Landing, where he and Aerys became friends. Tywin did, he fully adapted the unofficial Targ motto of bow or burn. You know, you threaten somebody into submitting to you, or you rain them out, you kill them out. That's how we got the whole Reigns of Castamere situation. So that brings us back to a little bit of this quote from The World of Ice and Fire from the Targaryen kings, Aegon V. It says, Aegon V had become convinced that such incestuous unions did more harm than good. Instead, he resolved to join his children in marriage with the sons and daughters of some of the greatest lords of the Seven Kingdoms, in hope of winning their support for his reforms and strengthening his rule. That is mirrored almost exactly by this George quote about Tywin. Somebody asked him, he says, given the context, it always seems strange that the marriage of Tywin Lannister to a first cousin, and even stranger when you consider how pragmatic and ambitious Tywin was, or was it truly a love match? And George answers, noble houses usually make marriages of convenience to build alliances. So again, you spread the seed. As a matter of fact, it's a common practice not only among the noble class, but also among the middle class and even the peasants. So all through that system. So he says, if somebody has a piece of land, he marries his daughter with somebody who has an even bigger piece of land, and then that grows and grows and grows. And then he says, there's another clear motive, talking about Tywin still, another clear motive, which is to reinforce the family's bloodline. Ta-da! The Targaryens are the extreme example of that policy. They only marry within the family to keep the purity of the blood, and that way you avoid the problem of having several candidates for the throne or the rule of the family. Yeah, so they're coveting this Ozymandias sign of oppression. That's not good. That's not good. So when Fire and Blood came out a few years ago, and I was sitting there reading it, and I went to New Jersey for the release, and have a signed copy, and got to say hi to George again, all this cool fun stuff, and I'm just kind of sitting there by myself. I went by myself, and I was reading it, and got to this point, about fell out of my chair. The whole doctrine of exceptionalism basically says the roots were not in Andalos but in Old Valyria. There were different laws and traditions held sway. A man had only to look at them to know that they were not like other men. Their eyes, their hair, their very bearing, all proclaimed their differences. And the key line here, and they flew dragons. So this whole thing, this whole doctrine of exceptionalism, that the Targaryens can do this, but nobody else can, that is exactly from Animal Farm by George Orwell. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That's what the Targaryens, or anybody trying to practice this incest, is trying to do. They're making themselves more exceptional than everybody else. That's not how this author writes. I mean, he does, but that's not the final point he's trying to make. He's using that as a warning. Even between everybody's most beloved king and queen, Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, even they got backlash for their incest, and they just brushed it off. They're like, So Jaehaerys and Alysanne are just as gray as the other Targaryens. This isn't the only way, but this is one of the ways. From Fire and Blood, they shall curse your incest from the Dornish marshes to the wall, and every pious man will denounce you as the sinners that you are. And then we also get a suspected poor fellow who preached that the Seven sent the winter fever to punish House Targaryen for incest, had his tongue removed. So they were silenced? Is that not what Euron does? You're going to speak against me, so I'm going to cut your tongue out? which brings us to the section of George. Again, I am not condoning incest. That's what he says. In all of George's work that feature any sort of idea, suggested or real, practiced, the act of incest, it is always detrimental. And then I have all of the links in the video and whatnot of the Playboy interview where he says, avoid incest at all costs. He might write about incest, but he does not endorse it. And let me make that perfectly clear. And part of that, and he has said this a couple of times, is the idea of purity needs to go away because we should all be mutts and mongrels. This is his sentiment almost exactly that he writes in his werewolf story, The Skin Trade. This is why John is, despite him having Targaryen blood, he's a mutt, he's a mongrel. That's what he's going to choose. That's the identity he's going to go with. And then all throughout Ice and Fire, or the history, or Fire and Blood, you know, we have kings, the Targaryen kings that are practicing this incest, and people just do not openly accept it. The people that do accept it are the lords and clergy and maesters, somebody who is using it as an opportunity to boost themselves. Just like the Manderleys from the past, just maybe possibly something that might be pointing to the Manderleys with Rickon Stark in the future, the near future. It's grasping. King Abomination, and suddenly pious lords and even the small folk who had once loved Aenys turned against him. So there's a lot more. I'm going to start to go over a few smaller details, but hopefully by this point, after listening to this, but especially after reading everything that I have, you'll start to see this theme, very strong theme that he has yet to sway on. So if you're a shipper and your ship includes incest somehow, it's not going to end well. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not trying to change your mind. At this point in all of the fandom, everybody pretty much is solidified in their beliefs. I'm just trying to bring you another perspective of this, and the perspective of something that's directly from the author with his intent. Some smaller examples of this fire element of the incest is when Catelyn recommends something to Robb Stark about, oh, marry one of your third cousins, I don't know, something, or second cousin or first cousin, something like that, in the Vale. That never happens. And Catelyn, whose hair is kissed by fire, of course she's going to mention that. Same thing with Lysa Tully, her kissed by fire, her sister, mentioned something about Sansa marrying Sweet Robin. It's not going to happen, and, there's a reason why they suggested it, and there's a reason why it's not going to happen. So again, sometimes you have to include something in a story to show that it's wrong or bad or negative, whatever, however you want to phrase it, that it's not going to happen. You can't just say, look at the reader and say no. You have to show them. So cousin marriage and relations in A Song of Ice and Fire is considered incest. Blackwalder is one of our best examples. Shella went with hair like fire. That's how she's described. She was married to Lord Walder Went, and they're possible cousins. We do not get a breakdown of what that actually is, because their bloodline history at that point, like where they come from, I guess George just hasn't decided that it's enough of an importance yet to give more page space to. However, remember, everything that you read on the Song of Ice and Fire wiki website was put in by a reader like you or I, and it's better now, in the year of 2021, it's better now but there has been so much misinformation, or so many opinionated ideas slipped into that wiki page that you need to go do the research yourself. And that's why we're here. This is part of that research. Also, Shella Went is a Targaryen loyalist. And she mysteriously disappeared at the time, as both Lord Derry and his 8 sons, who have really weird, contradictory tales of their death at the hand of this other mountain. And they have been disposed of by another fiery figure that is Tywin, because in the Fire's mind, they're going to be only one. So them squids. So Theon not recognizing his sister and then like making sexual advances to her, guess what happens to his hand after he tries to do that? It gets flayed. I'm not saying that's like a direct, like old god got pissed off and made anything happen, but thematically in the books, that's what happened. And then it really pisses Theon off that even happened. So that was a bit of a blood betrayal, I guess you could say. A small tertiary one, I'm not, the Iron Islands aren't going to crumble into the sea because of it, but that was that small detail that George's threefold reveal, small detail, bigger detail, giant hit you over the head with it. That's what's happening there. And then there's even a point where Theon says, betray me if you want, it makes no matter, but count your fingers first and know the cost. Arianne and her dreams. Yeah, Arianne has this weird dream where she's thinking back to something that happened, what she was like as a kid. It says a tall, hard man with black eyes and a widow's peak. That's what she said. I dreamed, she said, when the sun went down, I sat cross-legged at my uncle's feet and begged him for a story. Arianne's getting mixed up with this incest situation. So again, that is one to add to the list to keep an eye on. I have a feeling she's going to be with Aegon first before Aegon meets Dany, and then there's going to be some sort of, again, like a blood betrayal there, and some Dracarys is going to be happening. But we'll just have to wait and see for the Winds of Winter for that one. And then I start to talk and give a few examples of Manderley manners and then Frey family values, which I've already sort of touched on a little bit, but there's a few other smaller points to it. With the Manderleys, it was Maester Luwin. Again, Maesters are more fiery associated, something with the South, amongst many other other things, other symbolic pieces. Maester Luwin is the one that suggested that Wyman marry Donella Hornwood. And plus, he also adds, she's past her fertile years, but that whole thing is rejected. Now, Lady Donella Hornwood went on to other bad situation, but again, that's a different video. But Ramsay is part of that Blue Icefire arc, so Lady Donella was kind of screwed no matter what happened, unfortunately. The Lannister twins, absolutely. Jaime and Cersei. I'm going to go over this one, but I have a lot more if you want to read about Jaime and Cersei. I could really write just like a whole page about Jaime and Cersei that just themselves. I'm not going to do that. But what we see going on here is two sides of the same coin. And Joffrey and Myrcella and Tommen are essentially what Dany has done with birthing her 3 little dragonlets, is self-pollination. There's so much between Cersei and Jaime, where they are like each other. They were born together. They're going to die together. They're spitting images of each other. This is more like a self-pollination thing. Again, this is where I'm going to highly, highly recommend that you read the story Night Flyers, because the Dragon Mothership that's kind of how she created Royd, was self-pollination. So that's what Dany did with her dragons eggs when she sort of figured out this like blood and fire secret, and that is what Cersei and Jaime did. But you didn't know that, did you? So those are the main plot points of incest in Martinworld, especially how it relates to A Song of Ice and Fire. There's a lot more that I could talk about. There's a lot more I did talk about in notes. I've been saying this a lot. This is always a hot topic. So I have no doubt in my mind that you guys also have some ideas about this. Yeah, controlling the blood of the dragon is about power. And really that can be expanded into like controlling the fire within us, just the power, the Ozymandias, the building this thing. You can only build it so big before it crumbles on itself. And George really is using his own set of rules for whatever quasi-science that he has going on in here. I mean, really, if he was sticking to real world rules, the Targaryens would not be otherworldly beautiful. They would look more like what in the real world, what we started to see happen to the Habsburgs and many other issues, even back to some, the Egyptians. So whether you're shipping this, whether you're looking at this from a political angle, whether you're looking at this from just a Martinworld literary angle, there's absolutely no question that he's not writing incest as any sort of betterment to the world. This is not going to be, Song of Ice and Fire is not a rebuild story where the dragons are coming back, the dragons are the rulers, that type of thing. He's built it in there as something that needs to be dismantled. Literally, figuratively, symbolically, all of that. So that's what I have for right now. If you have stuck with me this long, God's alive and dead, bless you. And thank you for your time. I hope this generates some good thoughts, some good literary exercises, some good comments, just, a good old time. Thanks.